Ever catch yourself, knocking on wood? Or maybe giving a little wave to a single magpie, just in case.
It's funny, isn't it?
It really is. It's this weird human thing, acting like maybe some unseen forces are actually listening in. Makes you wonder, what's really going on there?
Well, that's a perfect way to start because today we're really diving deep into the whole world of superstition.
Okay.
We've pulled together quite a bit of material, um, psychological studies, historical texts, looking across different cultures.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, trying to really get under the skin of what superstition actually is, why we seem to, well, cling to it, and why it persists, even with all the science we have now.
Exactly. And our goal here isn't to judge beliefs, right? It's more about trying to understand the nature of superstition itself.
Absolutely.
And one of the first things that kind of jumps out from the source is that figuring out what is a superstition. Well, it can be surprisingly slippery. It seems to change depending on who you ask and maybe where they're from.
You're spot on. If you look at the core elements, a few key themes pop up again and again in the definitions we found.
Like what?
Like beliefs that don't seem entirely rational, linking things to fate or magic, maybe some kind of supernatural influence. There's often this fear of the unknown mixed in there, and this feeling that stuff that happened before, even if it seems totally unrelated, can somehow predict the future.
Right. The classic examples, luck itself, right? Or carrying charms, astrology, fortune telling.
Yeah, ghosts, paranormal stuff, all that kind of thing.
But it's interesting, too, how the word superstition itself can be used.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes almost as a label to dismiss beliefs we don't share. I noticed it mentioned that it can be used for religions that aren't mainstream, or even by people who aren't religious at all.
That's a really crucial point, and modern definitions often really lean into this conflict with, our scientific understanding of the physical world. Sources like Weiss, Risen, Damisch, even the big dictionaries like the OED or Merriam-Webster, they all kind of point to this irrational belief that goes against what we know about cause and effect. There's no logical connection.
Gotcha. So if science says, I don't know, a rabbit's foot won't actually help you win the lottery, that fits the definition.
Pretty much.
But what our sources also seem to stress is just how variable this whole idea is. Like, what's perfectly normal in one culture might look totally superstitious to another.
Precisely. Weiss and Martin both make this point. If a culture hasn't fully bought into, say, a Western scientific model, what we might call superstition could just be, well, their local way of explaining things, their science or their religion.
So it's all about context.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Weiss adds another layer. He calls it instrumentality. For it to be real superstition, the person has to believe it actually does something. Rubbing the rabbit's foot genuinely affects their lottery chances. They're not just doing it for kicks. That expectation of a real outcome is key.
That makes a lot of sense. The intent behind it matters, which brings us neatly to a really interesting overlap. Superstition and religion, they seem tangled up throughout history, sometimes even fighting each other.
Oh, definitely. The sources show how religious practices that were, let's say, outside the norm often got slapped with the superstitious label. Think about the old Latin word superstitio or the Greek deus daimonia. They weren't just descriptive. They often carried this negative weight, suggesting like over-the-top rituals or being way too quick to believe in prophecies and stuff.
Almost like being too religious, but in a way others didn't approve of. A bit excessive.
Exactly. The ancient Greeks and Romans, they valued order, proper respect for the gods, what they called religio.
Right.
They kind of looked down on excessive fear or, frantic rituals. That fear-driven stuff was often superstitio.
Right.
Cicero even said, one does not destroy religion by destroying superstition. Shows they saw a difference even back then.
That's a powerful quote. Suggests they knew not all belief was the same. And this idea seems to have carried on, right? Diderot's encyclopedia apparently linked superstition with any excess of religion and specifically called out paganism.
Yeah, and even someone like Martin Luther, during the Reformation, he didn't pull any punches, called the papacy a fountain and source of all superstitions.
Wow. Strong words.
And what's really fascinating is that the Catholic Church itself, in its catechism, actually addresses this. It calls superstition a perverse excess of religion, like a failure to fully trust in God's plan.
So it's a critique from within, in a way.
Exactly. And it warns against giving magical significance to practices that might otherwise be okay or even required. The emphasis is on the interfaith, the actual disposition, not just, going through the motions hoping for a magical result.
So it's not necessarily the act itself, but the why behind it, the underlying belief that can push it into superstition, even within religion. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Our sources also talked about ways to categorize superstitions. Harmoning had some categories.
Yeah, Dieter Harmoning offered a pretty useful framework. He suggested 3 main buckets: magic, divination, and observances.
Okay.
And then observances get split further into signs and time.
Let's start with observances then. What are signs?
Signs are about interpreting things you see or experience, like how animals behave, a bird acting weirdly or a horse spooking, or seeing something unusual in the sky, like a comet. Even interpreting dreams falls in here.
Right.
The key thing, according to another source, Chardonnans, is that usually someone just needs to observe it and then figure out what it means. They're not actively causing the sign.
Okay, like seeing that black cat cross your path. You didn't make it happen, but you interpret it. What about the time part of observances?
That relates to beliefs tied to specific times, like the idea that certain days, dog days, or Egyptian days are unlucky or powerful, or trying to predict the whole year based on, say, New Year's Day, lunar cycles, that kind of thing.
Interesting. Attaching meaning to the calendar. Okay, so it's divination. Sounds more active.
It generally is. Chardonnans highlights that divination needs a more active participant. Someone taking deliberate steps to uncover hidden knowledge, usually about the future.
Examples.
Things like judicial astrology, necromancy, trying to talk to the dead, reading omens in animal guts, that's aerospec. Using lots, geomancy, aeromancy, even certain types of prophecy fit here.
Okay, so a definite effort to find out something hidden, which leaves us with magic. How's that different?
Magic in this framework tends to be the most hands-on and ritualistic. Think witchcraft, brewing potions, chanting incantations, using protective amulets. It involves specific actions and procedures intended to directly cause a desired outcome.
Right. So observances, reading signs, divination, seeking answers, magic, trying to make things happen. Is that roughly it?
That's a pretty good summary, yeah. And Chardonnans also talks about prognostication, trying to know the future through established methods as sitting somewhere between just observing and active divination. He notes how important time-based predictions have been historically. And he lumps prophecy under divination too. Old Testament prophets, interpreting biblical signs, prophecies by saints. He points out the medieval church was often okay with prophecy because it was linked to religious experience.
That's a really interesting connection. Prophecy, which we might think of as purely religious, viewed through this divination lens. Did Chardonnans break down prophecy types?
He did, yeah. He talked about divinely inspired prophecy, then something called jesendelic, which seems to be more about a natural ability, and then wiglung, which lacked clear inspiration. But he kind of concluded that in practice, most prophecy ended up being treated as divinely inspired anyway.
Okay, this framework is helpful for sorting things out. But as we touched on, calling something a superstition?
Yeah.
It's usually not a neutral term, is it?
Not at all. It generally carries a negative judgment. That's why, in folklore studies, they often prefer the term folk belief.
Right.
Chardonnans himself actually criticized the Oxford English Dictionary definitions for being a bit judgy, implying it's all based on fear and ignorance, and missing the potentially complex systems or religious roots behind some beliefs.
Yeah, it's easy to dismiss something if you don't understand the context of the system behind it. And Richard Webster made a great point about subjectivity, didn't he? How one group often labels another's beliefs as superstitious.
Exactly. He mentioned Constantine looking down on paganism, Tacitus calling early Christianity a pernicious superstition, even figures like Saul of Tarsus before he became Paul, and Martin Luther later on, essentially calling non-Christ-centered beliefs superstitious.
It really drives home Dale Martin's observation that the definition just varies so much across cultures. What's normal here might be totally bizarre somewhere else.
Definitely makes you think about your own perspective.
It does. Okay, let's look at the word itself. Superstition. Where did that actually come from? What's the etymology?
It's Latin. Superstare. Literally means something like to stand over, stand upon, or survive.
Survive. That seems odd.
Yeah, the original meaning isn't totally clear. Could have meant standing in awe, maybe being excessive in religious rites, or possibly the survival of old, maybe outdated beliefs or practices.
So it might not have started out negative.
Possibly not. Some early uses, like in Plautus or Pliny the Elder, apparently just meant the art of divination. It seems to be later, in classical Latin with writers like Livy and Ovid, that it really picks up that negative meaning we know today, excessive fear of the gods versus proper awe, religio.
And Cicero had that specific idea linking it to survivors, the superstitiosi, and parents worrying if their kids would survive to perform funeral rites.
Exactly. And Michael David Bailey adds that Pliny linked magic and superstition, and that it was Roman authorities who first called Christians superstitious. Then, of course, later on, Christians flipped it and called Roman and pagan beliefs superstitious because they involved false gods. So the term itself has been a bit of a weapon in cultural and religious debates.
Seems like it carries a lot of historical baggage.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to psychology. What can psychology tell us about why we hold on to these beliefs?
Psychology offers a few angles. Behaviorism, for instance. B.F. Skinner's famous 1948 pigeon experiment comes up a lot.
Right, the pigeons.
He saw pigeons developing these little rituals, turning circles, head bobbing, seemingly trying to get food, even though the food came out on a fixed schedule anyway.
Yeah.
He saw it as a basic model for how superstitious behavior might develop.
Like they thought their actions caused the reward, even when they didn't.
That was his initial interpretation, yeah. Now, others like Staden and Simmelhag later challenged the specifics of why the pigeons did those particular things.
Okay.
But Skinner's broader idea about reinforcement schedules, especially intermittent reinforcement getting rewarded only sometimes, that's been really influential for understanding human superstition. The partial reinforcement effect suggests that if a behavior only pays off occasionally, it actually becomes harder to extinguish, more persistent.
Ah, that makes total sense. That one time it works keeps you doing it, even if it usually doesn't. What about evolutionary or cognitive approaches?
Well, evolutionarily, the argument goes something like this. It might have been safer for our ancestors to assume a connection that wasn't there than to miss one that was actually vital for survival.
Better safe than sorry, basically.
Kinda, yeah. So maybe we're slightly wired to see patterns, even weak ones. Then there's the cognitive side, looking at links with things like OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, especially something called magical thinking.
Magical thinking. We heard that term before. Can you break it down?
In the context of OCD, it's this strong belief that if you don't perform certain actions, certain compulsions, something bad will happen either to you or someone else. It seems more common in people from more religious backgrounds or cultures where magic is, more accepted.
How does that play out?
It could be feeling you have to do a ritual to make sure a good prophecy comes true, or just this intense urge to do something just in case to ward off disaster, avoiding unlucky things like the number 13 or clinging to lucky objects.
So it's quite powerful, quite anxiety-driven.
Yeah.
And Jane Risen's dual process model, how does that fit in?
Risen suggests superstitions often start as these quick gut reactions, what psychologists call system 1 thinking. It's intuitive, automatic.
Okay.
Our more rational brain, system 2, might actually recognize that thought is illogical, but we don't always correct it. We have this superstitious impulse. It's maybe silly, but we sort of go with it anyway.
It's like that little voice you can't quite shake, even if your logical brain is saying, that's ridiculous. So how do these superstitions actually work in practice? Do people think they're really changing fate?
Often it seems the belief is more about influencing the likelihood of something happening rather than creating a totally new outcome. Think sports rituals.
Right, lucky socks.
Exactly. The player probably doesn't think the socks give them superpowers, but they might feel it helps them focus, play their best, maybe tips the odds slightly. Stuart Vyse noted that for ages, research just focused on how irrational it all was. But some newer stuff suggests rituals themselves, even superstitious ones, can actually lower stress and improve performance. Not because of magic, but because the ritual action itself is calming or focusing, like calming magic.
Interesting. So the act has a psychological benefit separate from the belief. And when are we most likely to reach for these supernatural explanations?
Two situations really stand out in the research: highly unlikely events and negative events. When something really weird or improbable happens, we're more likely to think, whoa, maybe something supernatural is going on. Maybe because it taps into our desire for control or explanation when the usual causes aren't clear.
Right, trying to make sense of the unexpected.
And then negative stuff. We tend to attribute bad things to superstitious causes more than good things. It's called negative agency bias. Think of curses, like the Red Sox curse of the Bambino, or people getting mad at their computer like it's deliberately messing up.
Huh. Yeah, that definitely rings a bell.
Yeah.
You rarely hear about a curse of good fortune. Okay, switching tracks again. How does this stuff affect, say, consumer behavior or even politics?
Well, some researchers view superstitions as a kind of mental shortcut, a heuristic that can influence buying decisions.
Oh, so
People who generally score higher on superstition scales are apparently more likely to believe in things like astrology, worry about bad luck omens, and this correlates with things like gambling, playing promotional games, maybe certain stock investments, forwarding those superstitious chain emails, keeping good luck charms, even being a really die-hard sports fan. And the financial impact can be real. There was an estimate mentioned that Friday the 13th alone causes huge losses, hundreds of millions, just from people avoiding travel or business deals.
Wow, that's staggering for one day. And the politics angle. You mentioned Polybius on ancient Rome.
Yeah, the idea was that shared superstitions could actually help hold society together, acting as a tool of governance and instrumentum regni, reinforcing social norms and cohesion.
So collective belief shaping society. Interesting. But just as there's belief, there's also been pushback, right? Opposition to superstition.
Oh, absolutely. Back in the classical world, when philosophers were debating the very existence of gods, you naturally got critiques of superstition. Lucretius, Cicero, again with his De Natura Deorum. Cicero, as we said, distinguished superstitio from religio and argued only the first should be abolished. Even the Roman Empire apparently had laws against stirring up excessive religious fear.
And later on.
Well, you had things like Emperor Frederick II in the Middle Ages banning trials by ordeal as irrational.
Yeah.
Then the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, they obviously fueled disbelief in things not backed by evidence.
Right.
And the Age of Enlightenment really put opposition to superstition front and center. Thinkers like Baruch Spinoza were very outspoken critics early on. The focus really shifted towards reason.
It's like this ongoing dialogue or tension between belief and reason through history. Now, let's touch on just how varied these things are globally. Regional superstitions.
It's amazing, isn't it? Most superstitions are really tied to local history, environment, maybe old religious ideas.
Examples.
Like beliefs about geckos having medicinal value in parts of Asia, or feng shui in China, how the placement of things, even house numbers, affects luck. That thing about the number 8 being lucky in the housing market there.
Yeah, fascinating. And then there are the ones linked to specific things. Animals, numbers, objects, actions.
Oh yeah, tons of those. Black cats being unlucky in some Western places, but maybe lucky elsewhere. Locomotive engineers apparently used to worry about hares crossing their path. That strange one from Brazil about drivers targeting giant anteaters.
Weird. And numbers.
Huge. Fear of 13 triskaidekaphobia. Fear of 4 in East Asia tetraphobia. Even fear of 666. Buildings skipping floors.
Right. Objects, too. Rabbit's foot for luck, especially popular during the Depression, apparently. Those Tetek Melek masks in Indonesia during COVID. Breaking mirrors, obviously bad luck. Horseshoes for good luck, though people argue about which way up they should go.
Sailors nailing them to masts. Yarrow stalks and tortoise shells in China seen as lucky. Even brooms, bad luck to use a new broom near the new year in some places.
And actions. Not walking under ladders, touching wood, throwing salt over your shoulder if you spill it, not opening umbrellas inside.
That umbrella one might have started because early umbrellas in London were huge and dangerous indoors.
Huh. Practical origins.
Yeah, maybe. Wearing certain colors in China for luck, saying break a leg in the theater.
Which has that alternative murd among dancers, right?
Exactly. And some might have practical roots, like looking both ways at train tracks becoming a ritualized crossing action.
It really shows how embedded these become.
Okay, almost wrapping up. Our sources mentioned a couple of related terms. Magical thinking again, and quasi-magical thinking.
Right. So magical thinking more broadly is just that belief that unrelated things are causally linked, often supernaturally.
Like thoughts affecting the world.
Yeah, or things that look alike or touched in the past still having a connection. It's a common type of, well, illogical reasoning pattern.
Okay. And quasi-magical thinking.
That's when you act as if the superstition is true, even if you don't fully believe it. You know it's not rational, but you do it anyway, just in case.
That's the knocking on wood feeling. And finally, this idea of an effective theory in science. How does that connect?
It's an interesting comparison. An effective theory in science is one that works really well within certain limits, even if it's not the ultimate complete picture. Like Newtonian physics works great for everyday stuff, but you need relativity for extreme speeds or gravity.
The idea mentioned was that maybe all scientific theories are effective in this way. They have boundaries. And perhaps this leaves room in the human mind for other kinds of explanations, like superstition, especially when facing the unknown or things science hasn't fully explained yet.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. This has been a really wide-ranging look. It's clear superstition isn't just, simple irrationality. It's tangled up with our history, our psychology, different cultures, even language itself.
Absolutely.
It really makes you reconsider maybe your own little rituals or beliefs and how you view those of others.
It seems like while science gives us this amazing framework for understanding the world, there's still this deep human need for explanation, maybe for a sense of control, especially when things feel uncertain, and maybe, just maybe, a fascination with, a touch of magic.
Yeah.
It leaves you thinking about where that line is in your own life, between a helpful ritual, a meaningful tradition, and something that might actually be holding you back, a superstition that limits you.
That's a really good point to ponder, the great final thought. And definitely, if any specific part of this deep dive caught your ear, maybe the psychology or the history or specific cultural examples, we really hope you'll explore it further. There's so much more out there.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.